Welcome, welcome. So yeah, today hope you guys are having a I hope you're having a good I'm having a good morning. Hope you're having a good, I guess, evening. But this topic, I'm actually kind of excited to talk about this topic because it's something I've never really discussed on the channel. But I mean, it's something that is really a cornerstone to critical thinking, and critical thinking. You know, it sounds really like dry, almost an academic, but it's it's another term for, I think, like self mastery, right? Self mastery, seeing clearly, right? What um what Aristotle would talk about, thinking clearly, right? What many philosophers would talk about, as would discuss as thinking clearly, and thinking it's not even just rationally. There's a whole field of what's called phenomenology and all that stuff, right? Where we talk about experiencing clearly, right? So there's critical thinking as a foundation for for really self mastery, and I think one aspect of critical thinking that's sorely lacking today in today's modern world is statistical thinking. And so there are two branches. Let's even talk about what I'm going to try to make this like actually interesting, because I know like statistics can be really dry, but people misuse statistics. People misuse statistics all the time, right? So there are two ways, in philosophy, right? We talk about there are two basic ways to find truth, right? You talk about deductive logic, you talk about inductive logic, and then phenomenology and all that stuff. They talk about experience, raw experience, and things like That's another conversation entirely. But inductive logic, right? Deductive logic and inductive logic. So when people make statistical claims, which they make all the time, they you know they seem really smart. They seem really accurate. They seem really influential. But many times they're either not saying anything, they're saying things inaccurately, or misleading. All right, and so let's understand. Let's actually understand some of the first things. Um, so let me just start with a story. Not a story, but an example. An example of how people lie with statistics, whether they lie intentionally or just say something misleading without meaning to. So Jordan Peterson, take him or leave him. Think of him as you want, but make of him what you will. And he was, I think he was in a debate one time, and he was going back and forth with the debater, and he was talking about how, um, yeah, so statistics meaning like, yes, graphs, data, like how people lie with data, how people misuse data, right? Uh, so data can tell us a lot, but data can tell us a lot but data can be misused, right? And so one way that I remember Jordan Peterson talking about, like, men are more interested in things, and women are more interested in people. And hey, whatever is true, right? We cannot be ideological either way, right? Whether you believe men and women are a certain way, or men and women are not a certain way, whatever, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what's true is true, right? What's false is false. But that statement, like, men, are on average are on more interested in things, and women are more interested in people. Well, he's taking it from, there are two problems with this statement, okay? Two problems. One, and I'm just using it as an example. People in all sorts of, you know, all sorts of persuasions, all sorts of opinions, say all sorts of stuff. Um, but there are two problems with this. One is that it is he's taking it from one study, right? And we actually have to look at the study itself. And we'll talk about how to, like, when somebody sends you a study, some research, how do you actually validate it? How do you evaluate it? How do you see whether that's like a good study or the study is concluding, what they say it concludes, right? So he's taking it from one study. That's kind of an issue in itself, and we'll talk about why. But he's also taking that claim, that statistical claim, from not only one study, but we would have to look at how the study is designed. Like, how are you measuring things versus people, right? Like, what is the breakdown? Those are what are called qualitative variables, right? So, how are you defining those things? Are we making a broad generalization, too broad of a generalization? The second problem with this claim, with the statistical claim, and this is, I think, one of the biggest problems that people, or the biggest mistakes, or the biggest problems that I see with influencers who talk about statistics, or any kind. How many times have you heard a claim such as people of this race or religion, X% of people of this race or religion or background, have whatever criminal convictions or go to higher education, and then versus Y% of this other group have criminal convictions or get certain medical treatment or go to certain higher education or whatever. How many times have you heard things like that? Well, I'm here to tell you that statements like that pretty much are meaningless. They're pretty much meaningless. Why? Well, I'll talk about it. All right, so let's go back to Jordan Peterson's example when he talks about, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people, right? Let's take that claim. Well, what he and other people who make similar statistical claims, what they're trying to claim is, yes, okay, maybe that is actually statistically true. Maybe if you go to a giant database, you can actually see that that's true, right? That may be true. But what the speaker is usually trying to make us think and make us conclude is that there's a certain certain cause, right? That is because of something specific that they want to convince you of. In Jordan Peterson's case, he wants to convince us that those are, biological differences. Somebody else might make even the same claim, right? Exactly, Nikhil, right. Somebody else might make the same claim. Okay, here are these gender differences, and those are due to maybe social differences, right? So you see, the same person can take the same data. I mean, we could take racial data, for instance. We could take, and it's a fact. I think this is true. I think this is true. If you look at United States data, that Hispanic, yeah, it definitely is true. Hispanic and Black people end up having a higher incarceration rate than white people, right? Okay, arrest and conviction rate. Okay, well, we would think if the law is fair, then everybody it should be about 50-50, right? Not necessarily. So we have to look at a couple of things. We have to consider, right? Before we consider that maybe even there's racism, we could go, I'm showing you how we can go in the opposite direction, and people can be biased in both ways. Before you can conclude that maybe there's racial bias, for instance, right, which there is evidence, there definitely is evidence, but I'll show you, I'll talk about how in a moment we would find evidence of that. We can't do it through raw data, as most people claim to do when they make these kinds of statements, broad statements. Never trust these kinds of statements. Always ask these further questions, okay? When people make these statements, because they don't mean anything, right? When we make those statements, right, if we were to look for, before we look for racial bias, we might try to eliminate other things. Are there certain geographical factors? Are there certain types of crimes? Are there certain types of, there's a lot of different factors that we would want to look at. Social factors. Are there socioeconomic factors involved, right? The idea when we hear a raw statistic like this, again, X% of people are do this or behave this way. Y% of people, behave or do this way or have this outcome. Always question it. Always question it. You always want to ask, well, what other factors have we eliminated? What factors have we eliminated that might be causing what we perceive here or what we see here in this data, in these data, right? So, and most people don't even question that. Most people just take the raw data and they use that to feed their own bias, their own ideology, right? And if you're not careful, you can be very easily deceived by those types of statistical statements. So understand when people say, "Oh, X% of people do this, Y% of people do that," and it's the, hey, look, here's the data, right? I can show you. Be very, very skeptical. Ask those questions. Well, what is the cause of that outcome? Have we considered? Have we studied? Now, how do we determine the cause? When we see data, how do we determine the cause? We have to do different. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty like statistical tests and stuff like that you do. You can open a statistics book and study that, but basically, if you want, but basically, you want to look for you want to take samples of this big data, right? And you can look for them. You can look and you can look on, you can even just do a Google search and you can look for studies. And I'm going to talk about in a moment how do we actually evaluate studies, right? So that we don't get deceived when somebody sends you a research showing, oh, the group that, I'm in favor of, their policy is better for this or that, right? So everybody wants to show that their side is true, right? So you'll always cherry pick. We will always do this. We will have this tendency to cherry pick studies or research that shows, what we think is true. So if people show you stuff like this, understand you need to know how to read a study. So I'll get into that in a moment. But you need studies for these broad statistical claims that people make. What you need is studies to, that's my dog. You need studies to determine causation. And again, how do we determine causation? It's not correlation, like two things are associated. No, that's not it. It's through eliminating one by one, doing studies that eliminate certain possibilities. I'll give you an example. Just to make this really concrete. This is a simple way of understanding statistical thinking, okay? Like determining causality. And here's my dog. Of course, she wants to be on the live stream every time she got a haircut. Am I CGI? Am I AI? I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or what. I am not CGI. I am not AI. I am real. So, but don't discriminate against AI, because in the future we may have fully sentient AI and guess what? Or fully sapient AI, and guess what? They have their rights too. So anyway, guys. So okay. What was I saying in terms of just put up with my dog. She's gonna do what she's gonna do. But just try to listen to me as I'm saying this. So, if we wanted to determine causation, we would have to do various studies. Now, oh yeah, I was gonna give you the example. So let's say this is an easy way to understand statistical thinking. So let's say you go outside and it's wet outside, right? It's wet on the ground. Let's say, what would you conclude? Well, what's reasonable to conclude? What's the most reasonable thing to conclude? Do I hear it in the chat? So if you go outside and there's water on the ground, what is it do you think is most likely to conclude? Probably it rained, right? So you might think, okay, it rained. So if you're really a statistical thinker, right? Yeah, in most cases, of course, that's going to be true. It's like it's raining, right? Okay. But if we want to be a real statistical thinker, we can't just automatically conclude, oh, it rained. What would we do to collect evidence? We would not engage in what's called verification, where we try to look for evidence that it rained. That's not what we do. That's actually not a statistical or scientific way of thinking. What we would do instead is we would try to come up with other possibilities. What are some other possibilities? Okay, people, set up sprinklers outside. So there were sprinklers, that just went off, maybe. Went off not too long ago and caused the ground to be wet. Maybe some kids were playing with some water balloons outside, and then the ground is wet because of that. Maybe even people dumped water on the ground. Somebody dumped water on the ground, right? That could be a possibility. So, what we do in statistical thinking and really scientific thinking in inductive reasoning is we try to eliminate all the possible variables. We investigate each one. What evidence is there for each of these possibilities? And one by one we try to eliminate until we find the best explanation. And guess what? Sometimes the best explanation might not be what you were thinking. It might not be what you think was the most reasonable one, that it rained. There might be actual evidence that, yeah, like before you went outside, there were like sprinklers running through your neighborhood. There were like sprinklers. People were running sprinklers. It might be a hot summer day, right? So, so that is part of the idea. You cannot assume what you think to be the most reasonable. You have to investigate by actively eliminating what you think are possibilities. What does that help us do? It helps us avoid what's called confirmation bias. It helps us avoid thinking about what we want to be true, because we have this tendency, and we have to resist it as human beings. We have a tendency to see patterns and to verify what we think is true or what we think is most reasonable. And it's actually a really bad habit if our goal is the truth. If our goal is not the truth and we want to live in our own ideological world and be comfortable and be safe and feel like we have all the answers and all of that, then fine. Then you don't have to follow this method, right? But if you want self mastery, if you want to totally master your mind and think clearly and make decisions clearly and be in control of your own mind, be in control of your own actions, be in control of your own decisions, really control your life, then we should take this approach of falsification. And sometimes the truth is going to hurt. Sometimes what's true is not what we would like to be true, but we still have to accept the truth. So I'm talking about, Silvic, welcome. I'm talking about how people use lies, how people lie with statistics, how people misuse statistics to try to prove something or try to make some claim. And I'm talking about what to watch out for when people do that. So definitely really important nowadays because people make statistical claims all the time. So let's talk about how to actually evaluate a study. Let's say one of your friends, all right, or one of your colleagues or whatever, they send you a study, and let's say the study is that, I don't know, let's switch from a political study to like a health study. Let's say they tell you, well, so many grams of protein, like 160 grams of protein lead to better muscle gains, right? Then then let's say 100 grams of protein per day. Let's say that they say like 160 or 180 or something. Let's make it a big difference. 180 grams of protein. Let's make it more interesting. I don't know, protein's not controversial. Let's say like green tea, or some herb, right? There's some herb that actually reduces like cancer, right? Let's say that. Let's say somebody sends you a study that says like there's a certain herb that actually improves cancer outcomes. Okay, so here are some red flags you should look out for. So the first things first is they send you, let's say, a study showing that let's say it's vitamin D, right? Vitamin D decreases cancer risk, something like that. Fortunately, nowadays we actually do have some good human studies. But let's say they send you a study on this, and what you see instantly, they're like all excited, like, oh yeah, see, this is gonna improve cancer, right, and cure cancer, whatever. So now again, somebody might be right, they might be wrong, but what do we look out for in the study? Well, one, we look at, is it a human study, first of all? Right? Most health studies, a lot of health studies where they start is they, for good reason, for ethical reasons, they don't start with humans. They start with a lot of times animals, or even before they start with animals, they start with like just tissue samples, right, from animals, and they'll see, okay, does this substance inhibit cancer cell growth? And if it does inhibit cancer cell growth, then they will, go to some animal studies. But let's say if it's an animal study or a cancer, like a cell study, something like that, a group of cells, then understand that's not reliable data, not yet. It's not reliable data in the first place. It's what's called a preliminary study. Now, let's say they send you a human study. What should you look for? Well, one is the sample size. Sample size. So a sample size, what is a sample size? It's like how many people were involved in the study, all right? How many people? So was it to be a fairly accurate study, to assume what's called normality? I'm not going to go into all that. To assume what's called normality, you would have to be above at least like 30 participants. So if it's below 30 participants in the study, you should automatically be skeptical. All right, automatically say, oh, these are not good results. It's below 30 participants. All right. Typically, the more participants, the better. If you can have 100 participants, if you can have 1,000 participants, it's not always feasible to do it, right? But if you're in the range of like 60, 100, probably like 100, I like 100 participants, then it's a good number. It's a good number. So look at the sample size of the study. Also, what you want to look at, and a lot of low quality garbage out there that people will send you to try to prove their point, they'll send you studies that are not what are called randomized. Okay, you need what's called randomization. You need randomization. And this is not for every study because I want to be as universal as possible. So I'm not going to talk about like double blind, placebo controlled. Yeah, all that stuff is really important in general, but I'm not going to focus on that. Randomization is the most important one. I actually see this a lot with political studies, political polls, right? Very biased political stuff that people send to people or post online. You look at this, right? And you should be armed with this. You should look at, let's say somebody sends you, oh, I saw something recently like somebody sent me like left wing people who have left leaning ideologies are like have a greater tendency toward violence. All right. Hey, could it be true? Maybe. Could it be false? Maybe, right? We don't know the truth, okay? I don't really buy that kind of generalization. I think people tend to be violent regardless of, I don't think there's association between political party necessarily. Um, but Nikhil, like the UN makes World Happiness Reports every year with 1,000 people. Yeah, right. Yes, right, exactly. 1,000 people. It's still a good sample size, Nikhil, 1,000 people. But the thing about it is, and I'll talk about this shortly, why it could be a good sample size. It could also be randomized, right? So this may or may not. There are other things that determine whether that's a good study, Nikhil. I'll actually talk about that now. So let's talk about randomization. So randomization, automatically you should see in the methods section of a study that it was randomized. If you don't see that it's randomized in the methods section of a study, then it's false, right? It's not a good study. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an extreme example why randomization is important, meaning randomly choosing people from a certain population. that you're studying. Why is it so important? Because you can bias the results. A very clear example would be, let's say you want to find out how many people are in support, what percentage of the population is in support of, let's say, universal, like single payer healthcare, let's say. Well, if you go to one way you might be manipulative with these statistics and the study design is if you don't randomize. Let's say you go to and I'm again just using it as an example. You could be a libertarian, you could not be a libertarian. It's up to you. No judgment. But let's say you go to a libertarian convention, right? And again, they're all like not in favor of those kinds of policies for the vast majority of them. So if you took a sample of people there, you'd probably get a result that like 98% of people are not in favor of single payer healthcare, right? And then you'd use that in your study. Do you see how it's not representative of the general population? What you would do instead is you have to randomize. It's why randomization is so crucial. So yeah, and my dog is really trying to get me here. So 1,000, Nikhil, 1,000 might be a good sample size. I'm pretty sure the UN would do a randomized sample. But you should check yourself. You shouldn't just trust the source. You should investigate. If you want to find the truth, you want to investigate and look at the study for yourself. The other thing you want to look at, and I see the number of stuff that I see that comes out that's sent to me that's not randomized is crazy. But the thing is, people don't look for that. People don't look for that. You always want to look, is it randomized, right? Now, another one might be the funding. So where's the funding for the study coming from? Who's funding the study? That will determine a lot, right? What was the method that they used? For instance, if you're taking a poll, especially if you're doing polling data, right? If you're doing polling data, I'll get back to the vitamin D study example in a moment. But if you're doing polling data, look at how the questions are worded. Sometimes people design studies to word the questions in a leading way, right? For instance, if I say, do you support cuts to this government program, right? That's pretty neutral. But if I ask you, do you support, cutting programs that offer life-saving support to people in need who don't have any other option, something like that. You see how that's a leading question. And of course, what are people going to say? I would hazard to say, a larger percentage of people would say no. So you see, look at how the question is worded. See if that's a misleading or a leading question, right? And that's very important as well. When it comes to studies, especially, for instance, health studies, health-related studies, like, for instance, that the study we're talking about, let's say, theoretically, hypothetically, that talks about vitamin D, right? Okay, vitamin D and cancer. Okay, well then, so for vitamin D and cancer, vitamin D, let's say, does it help in cancer outcomes? Does it improve cancer outcomes when people take it during cancer therapy, right? Oh, that's a good question. So let's say you had a study with 100 people, and you saw that the result was that, in a statistically significant way, that it reduced the cancer deaths, something like that. Of course, my dog is going to do this when I'm all right, I'm going to do this instead so she cannot bother. She's trying to bother me, right? Okay. Anyway, she wants to be on the live stream. See, I think she wants to be on the live stream, and it's like her way of. No, I don't think she really wants to be on the live stream. She wants my attention. That's what she wants. She knows I'm talking to somebody else on the phone, and she just wants my attention. She cannot stand. She's jealous. Okay. But anyway, so what was I saying? So yeah, the vitamin D. So yeah, let's say that we got a positive result. Let's say that showed a positive result. Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing that you want to consider. one study is one study, right? A population is typically very large. Let's say you're talking about the population of cancer patients who take vitamin D. That it might be, or cancer patients, right? That may be a very, very large population. And so if we had a study with 100 people, even though we had a statistically significant outcome, and all the methods were correct and all the methods are valid, right? And so we had an outcome that shows that people who took vitamin D had, less death due to cancer because of this. Still, it's a limited study. There are limitations, right? It just from the fact that it was only one study with only one sample, right? To have okay, to have a better result. Next time I'm gonna sit at my desk because she's really bothering me today. She's really bothering me. Anyway, to have a better result, to have more confidence that this actually is true, that this vitamin D, let's say, would be effective, safe and effective for cancer reduction, right? Cancer benefit outcomes, right? In order to confirm that result, we would have to have repeated studies. And so here's the principle of science, and here's the principle of statistics, right? Even if you have an outcome that was shown in one study, the idea is you have to. It's the principle of reproducibility in science. You have to always ask, how many of these similar studies are there? Is there more than one study out there? Is there more than 5 studies? Are there more than 5 studies showing the same results, with the same methods, right? So the idea is the more studies showing the same results, then the stronger that alternative hypothesis is, right? What we call the alternative hypothesis, meaning that the vitamin D does help cancer outcomes. So you want to ask about that. It's not enough. I mean, I've seen convincing studies. I actually, guys, I used to, my previous industry was health related products. So I've seen a lot of studies by companies that want to show, oh, this supplement is really, really great. It might be. There's nothing we shouldn't have some ideological opposition to supplements, for instance. But we should always ask, well, where is the evidence? And that's what we mean by evidence, right? Now you know what is meant by evidence. It's reproducibility. It's the right study methods that you're looking at. All right. Remember, you need randomization. You need you also need a big enough sample size, right? You need to look at who's funding the study. And you need to look at how many times this study was done getting the same result, right? And that's why, for instance, like the theory of gravity, it's a pretty good theory, right? It's a theory, right? If you do a study enough times and it shows the same results every single time, then it becomes a theory. It actually becomes what's called a theory, right? That's basically what science is, right? So that's why, for instance, gravity is a theory. Evolution is a theory. So the word theory means very, very strong, basically irrefutable evidence. It has been observed time and time again and has not been contradicted by any other results, right? There is no other explanation. In other words, there's currently no other explanation for what we see. So that's what a theory is. Before that, it's a series of hypotheses and then building up to that result. So hopefully you have had a better understanding of what it takes to identify a good study, identify good data. When people are making certain claims, don't be fooled when they make those claims. Ask these questions. Ask these questions because more and more, especially, there are posts online that show some data, make some statistical claim, data claim. There are politicians that make claims. There are influencers who make claims. And if we aren't asking these questions and we're not informed and we're not using these tools, we're going to be fooled. We're going to be caught up in their ideology of what they want us to believe instead of being independent thinkers and knowing how what we should believe based on our own thought process, based on correct methods. So yeah, guys, if you really like this topic, if you like all these topics, critical thinking and self mastery, check out my Critical Thinking Academy. Also, it's in the link in my bio, and you can check that out. It's actually in the link in any of my videos now. Actually, if you want a taste of it and you really want to understand what Critical Thinking Academy is all about, check out the free masterclass that I have in my link in the bio as well. So you can check that out. And guys, it's great spending time with you and becoming better critical thinkers together. I really appreciate you, and I will see you next time.